All right. Um, Good afternoon. In the interest of getting started here so we can maximize our time with our guest speaker, we'll get started. My name is Eric Hauge, and I'm the Executive Director of Homeline. And you are joining us today on Wednesday, March 10th at 1:30 in the afternoon for, I think Mike counted, and this is maybe our 46th webinar in our series that we started last April, answering questions and going through updates on COVID-19 eviction suspension rules and other related matters. So thankfully you're joining us today. We're going to be joined both by Margaret Kaplan, the president of the Housing Justice Center, who will be talking about the new St. Paul ordinances that went into effect earlier this month. And then we'll also have Homeline's managing attorney, Mike Raw, to go through some suspension updates and news on both a federal and a state level with the eviction suspension. Homeline's a statewide nonprofit. We advise renters over the phone or email in 4 languages: English, Spanish, Somali, and Hmong, and we've advised over 250,000 households since we opened in the early 90s. There's our hotline and our language lines. We've been doing these seminars every 2 weeks, and been lucky to be joined by some great guest speakers the past couple months, including today, but wanted to give folks a heads up that our next seminar, which is 2 weeks from today on Wednesday, March 24th, we're going to be joined by Rachel Robinson, who is the Deputy Commissioner of the Minnesota Housing. That's the state housing finance agency, who is tasked with overseeing the new COVID-19 emergency rental assistance program and the process for getting those dollars out the door in rental assistance for tenants and landlords. So she's going to be going over that program. Not sure if it's going to be up and running then or not, but she'll be sharing as much as possible at that point, and we'll have time for questions as well. You can register on our website on the COVID-19 tab. That's up right now. Just wanted to give another heads up that a former Homeline attorney, Paul Bernberg, just a few days after that last webinar I talked about, is working with Volunteer Lawyers Network and the Hennepin County Bar Association on a webinar on Monday the 29th from noon to 1 about security deposits in residential tenant landlord law. That will be a useful one, and you can register at that link. I'll put that in the chat as well in just a minute. As promised, we're going to go straight to Margaret Kaplan, the president of the Housing Justice Center. We only have her for a limited time, and she's going to run through some slides about these new tenant protection ordinances in St. Paul, as I believe Margaret was instrumental in helping advocate for some of these and help craft some of it. And also, I think if I'm right, you were on the I don't know what it's called. You want to tell me what it's called? The implementation
committee.
Okay. So you had sort of a hand in the process for getting the word out about these and sort of the information to the folks that need it. So I'm just going to hand it over to you, Margaret, if that's okay.
Great, that sounds good. Thank you for having me, and hello, everybody. My name is Margaret Kaplan. I'm the president of the Housing Justice Center. And for folks who don't know us, and you can advance the slide, the Housing Justice Center is a legal and policy advocacy organization. We're a nonprofit public interest organization, and our primary mission is to preserve and expand affordable housing opportunities for low-income households and individuals. And we have a real focus on very low-income households, really looking at things both for a affordability standpoint, but also looking at issues associated with like rights and justice and anti-displacement, as well as working on anti-discrimination cases as well too. You can flip the slide. And so I'm here to talk just a little bit about what are called the safe housing ordinances. If you look at all at the City of St. Paul information, SAFE stands for stable, affordable, fair, and equitable. And the first thing I want to say about the safe housing ordinances is these are not new ideas that came out of nowhere. These are ideas and policies that have been used in other communities, in other states, and even in certain properties in Minnesota. There also have some overlap with policies that have been passed in other local jurisdictions as well, too. They're also the product of a long period of engagement by the city with stakeholders. They did, I think, a really exceptional job of reaching out and having conversations within communities and inviting people into the discussion to make sure that as they were moving things forward, they were really listening to people and understanding what some of the potential unintended consequences would be. So the safe housing ordinances are now in the ordinance 20-14, chapter 193. Nope, you can forward the slide. And there are 5 elements to the safe housing ordinances. So the first is that it includes a rights and responsibilities information packet. The idea is to have something where people can look for information and guidance about what their rights are under both local ordinances and state and federal law as well, too, making it easy to understand and easy to digest. The second is limitations on security deposits. The third is tenant screening guidelines, then just cause notice requirements and advance notice of sale. And I'm going to go into these just with a little bit more detail, but also want to leave some time for questions. So I'm going a little fast. I apologize for that. The first one I'm going to talk about is security deposit limitations. So this is in section 193.03 of the ordinance. And what it says is that you can't charge more than 1 month of rent for a security deposit, and you can't require the prepayment of rent for more than 1 month. So in other words, bringing these two pieces together, when somebody is trying to move into a new place, you can't require them to pay more than 2 full months. However, there is an exception to this, and that is the landlord can charge up to an additional equivalent of 1 month rent if the prospective tenant doesn't meet their screening criteria. So in other words, they can do a little bit of a basically risk mitigation by charging slightly more for either a security deposit or prepaid rent. It actually allows the landlord to choose which direction they want to go in with this in order to expand the availability of housing opportunities for folks. The next category, and we can flip the slide, is tenant screening criteria. And so the tenant screening criteria really places a number of limitations on what factors can be utilized to screen potential tenants. Now, this doesn't say that you have to accept everybody who applies. You can still have criteria. You get to decide those, but there are certain categories of things where there are some limitations. For example, and this is sort of an abbreviated version of this, but for rental history, you can still use rental references, you can still use rental history. But what you cannot do is use evictions that are more than 3 years old as a basis for denying somebody the opportunity to live in housing today. With credit history and income, which are frequently used as screening criteria, it still allows landlords to use relevant information on a credit report. So if you haven't paid your bills, if you have outstanding debts, but you can't use the credit score by itself as your criteria. So you can't say nobody under a credit score of 640 gets to live in this apartment. On the income side, you can still require tenants to meet income requirements. So you can still say we have a threshold, but that can't be more than 2.5 times the monthly rent. So in other words, we were seeing folks who are running into 3 or 3.5, and this creates sort of more opportunities for folks who may have lower incomes to get into housing opportunities. And finally, and I have a weird typo in there. passive factor. And finally, there are limitations on the way that you can use criminal history. And it's based on the type of violation and the timing. And there are time limits on using criminal history as a factor, depending on the nature and the severity of the type of criminal occurrence. So what it's meant to do is to basically expand opportunities for folks who may have, maybe they have a juvenile record, but it's not something that has been kept on their record as an adult, or somebody who has, a gross misdemeanor from 8 years ago, following them around and preventing them from being able to access a housing opportunity. So it's meant to be more expansive. But, as I said, this doesn't say that you cannot screen people based on their criminal history. And likewise, looking at all of these things, it doesn't say that you can't require additional kinds of criteria or have different types of rules that you're making people agree to as a condition of being a renter. Next, please. And so another piece of the safe housing ordinances is the just cause provisions. This is in section 193.05. One thing that's really important to note, and I think people get confused about at times, is this isn't changing the eviction law or the eviction process. So the ability of a landlord to go to court and evict somebody for cause during the tenancy still exists. And that has not been changed at all. What it does do, though, is it limits the reasons for a non-renewal of a lease agreement. So in other words, when somebody is reaching the end of their lease agreement, you can only say, we're not going to renew your lease for a series of specific causes, and you have to provide a notice of what that cause is. This also doesn't limit the ability of tenants and landlords to agree to a mutual lease termination. We know that sometimes tenancies just aren't working out. They're not good for the tenants, they're not good for the landlords, and people can agree to say, look, we're going to end this amicably, and you can leave and still be okay. If you flip to the next slide, the just causes are outlined in the ordinance, and there's some pretty good guidance about what each of these mean, but it includes non-payment, repeated non-payment. So say they're up to date today, but they've missed 5 rent payments or been late 5 times in the last 12 months or whatever, like you can evict for that, or non-renewed for that, sorry. Material breach of the lease, a refusal of a tenant to renew the lease, that is also a reason to say, no, we're not going to renew you. Occupancy by the owner or a family member of the residential unit. So say you're renting out a single family home and you decide you want to move back in there. That is a reasonable cause for non-renewing someone. If you're going to demolish a building or convert it, if you're going to do a substantial rehab or renovation, if the government has ordered you to make the building vacant, if somebody's occupancy of a property is conditioned on employment, for example, there's housing associated with universities that's meant for people who work at the university, that is a cause, a just cause. And then also exceeding occupancy limits. One of the things I would say for each of these, the city has provided some really good additional detail about what they mean. And some of them do have a little bit of like detailed requirements in terms of, for example, what are we defining as that occupancy limit? And we can certainly, if people have questions about that, we can go into that next slide. And then finally, there is a section that is about advance notice of sale. So this is in section 193.06. Before, and this is very similar to the advance notice of sale provision that exists in Minneapolis. Before making a building available for sale, an owner has to provide notice to the tenants and to the city with 90 days advance notice. So in other words, it's just kind of giving people heads up. This is going to go for sale. This is going to be on the market. And this does a number of things. One, it allows tenants to plan for the future. And two, there's always a possibility that you could find a preservation purchaser who would be interested in ultimately acquiring a property. There's no requirement that somebody sell to that preservation purchaser, but it at least gives people that opportunity. The second part of this ordinance that's important is when a new owner acquires a building, they have to provide the tenants of notice within 30 days of the transfer of ownership, like I am your new landlord. And then finally, after the sale, there is a period of time of 90 days that's considered a tenant protection period. And during that time, the landlord isn't allowed to rescreen people using different criteria, and they're not allowed to raise the rent or to non-renew somebody's lease for that 90-day period. Or they could optionally, if they want to do things essentially right away after they're acquiring it, then they can do that if they pay people a certain amount of relocation compensation. And that's also laid out, the calculation for that in the statute, in the ordinance. Thinking about laws there. So that's just a very, very brief overview, but I see that we've gotten a number of questions that I would like to get to because I think that that's important.
Sure, Margaret. We're going to actually, attorney Mike Vrod jumping in here. I'll be doing the second portion of today's webinar as well, but I'll ask you some of the questions that we've had submitted in advance.
Okay.
About the ordinance, along with the ones that have popped up since you started talking, if that's okay. Good to see you again, by the way.
Yeah, good to see you too.
Let's start with this. This is from Jeffrey, a landlord. Always good, by the way, when you send in one of your questions, whether it's in the chat box or in the Q&A, to let us know if you're a landlord, a tenant, a social worker, a lawyer, whatever you might be, helps us sort of frame the question. Jeffrey, a landlord, asks, what is the legal basis for allowing one party to set a term contract to have infinite renewal options? Kind of a theoretical question about, is just cause, I guess, fair to landlords?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are a number of both states and types of housing that have these similar just cause provisions and requirements. So first, just to point out that this does not limit somebody's ability to change the use of the property, and it doesn't limit their ability to evict somebody for cause or to end a tenancy for one of these causes that are listed out. This is actually somewhat similar to the law that's associated with manufactured home community lots, for example, or tenancies in different kinds of subsidized housing. This is also consistent with just cause provisions in a couple of different states, including New Hampshire and New Jersey. The one argument that people occasionally bring up is questions about whether this may be in violation of the contracts clause. And I would say that it's not. Recent contracts clause jurisprudence says that regulation is fine. Like, you can regulate, and this is a similar kind of regulation, as long as you've got sort of a strong public rationale for doing so. But the intention isn't to kind of keep people in bad contractual situations. It's to sort of balance out the power between renters who, but for this, could have lost their housing for any reason or no reason at all, and landlords, really balancing those scales a little bit.
Okay. Shifting topics to the notice of the sale from Colette, a landlord. Will the notice of sale apply to all rentals or just multi-units? Also, what about delivery of notice? Is regular mail okay?
Yep. So there are a couple things in there, and I think that there are some important exceptions. So the first is that it does apply to all rental units, but doesn't matter on the size of the property. But it only applies to units and buildings that are affordable. So what they did is they made it apply to affordable housing buildings, which are defined in the ordinance as 80% and below AMI. And for a multifamily unit, they're going to look at whether 20% of the units in the building fall under that affordable definition. So it, so it has some exceptions to it. And what was the second part of the question?
Sorry. It was, what about delivery of notice? Is regular mail okay?
That is a really good question. I'm looking
Some
at
of
the
the-
details right now.
For the notice of sale one, I mean, the notice actually, it says written notice, and it actually has to be delivered to the DSI department, the Department of Safety and Inspection. So I'm not sure, is that department have an already designed notice? Or
Yeah, there is an already designed form that they have created. That's the advanced notice sale for tenant form. Let me see if
Jeffrey
I can
just pointed
find
out
it.
that he thought the notice of sale needs to be delivered to deed first.
So it doesn't get delivered to deed, but it does get delivered to the city, so to DSI. So they have to notice, the notice of sale has to be completed and submitted online, mailed, or hand delivered to the Department of Planning and Economic Development no later than 90 days prior to the sale. And the notice of proposed sale shall be delivered to all tenants residing in the affordable housing dwelling units no later than 90 days prior to the affordable housing being made available for sale. So one thing I'd say is that this doesn't appear to say one needs to happen before the other, but they both have to happen 90 days before it's made available for sale. So it sounds like you can do it contemporaneously. They also are going to, and they're in the process of creating, I think they already have them, just can't find them, the notice available in multiple languages as well too. One of the things that I would stress for folks is that the city has been working on a strategy that is sort of educating and informing people first before they go into any sort of compliance side of things. So they really want to make sure that they're providing a lot of good materials to people so they understand what their responsibilities are under these laws before they move into, being in the enforcement stage of things. And they're also very, very open to getting questions from people as well too, for the mechanics of this system.
Okay. New question, again, also submitted in advance from Kim, an attorney who represents landlords frequently, Kim Tennyson, who's been one of our guests twice, I think, on this show. Will there be an update on the status of the recently filed case, the lamplighter case filed against the city of St. Paul, questioning the constitutionality of the new St. Paul ordinance?
I can give a very brief update on that. So as folks may know, there was a case that was filed against the city of St. Paul fairly recently. It is in the Federal District Court of Minnesota. It is the same judge, Judge Magnuson, as was on the Minneapolis tenant protection ordinance case as well too, a case that's currently moving through the court system. It is now up on appeal. And this is
just to be sure or clear, the Minneapolis court decision, the first decision was favorable to the city.
Correct.
The landlord. Yes.
Yeah. So in Minneapolis, what they did is they filed a motion for a preliminary injunction, and they were not granted a preliminary injunction, and the landlords are appealing that. The St. Paul case is in sort of a similar posture. So they filed the case, and they also filed for a preliminary injunction, and that's going to be the first hearing, is going to be on the preliminary injunction. I believe they're supposed to be having that hearing very soon. It's in the next kind of few weeks. I can get people a date if you want. I believe that the city's answer is due next week. So
can you touch on the differences between the Minneapolis and the St. Paul ordinance, if there are any meaningful ones?
Yeah, there are a couple of really interesting differences. First of all, the Minneapolis ordinance was just about the tenant screening criteria and security deposits, where this also pulls in the other aspects of the case. Although I would say in the pleadings, a lot of it does continue to focus on the tenant screening criteria and security deposits, although they do talk about the just cause and advance notice as well. One of the arguments that they brought up in Minneapolis, which was really about in the tenant screening things that you could do the individualized assessment. So you could choose either individualized assessment or sort of these low barrier criteria. They made a big argument that nobody knew how to use that and it was void for vagueness. In this instance, in St. Paul, they don't have the individualized assessment. So they made kind of the opposite argument, which is you're not giving us enough flexibility to be able to assert our property rights by not having this. So that was sort of an interesting difference. Another difference is timing, which I think will make it'll make the arguments different. I don't know that it'll do much for the conclusion, but that is in Minneapolis, they filed the case after the ordinance was already in effect. So they filed it, I think it had been in effect for like 4 or 6 months. So it was already happening, which meant that the ability to facially challenge the ordinance was a little, you couldn't really do it in the same way. And that changes your standards a hair. Versus here, where they did file it before the ordinance was put into effect. Now, it had been passed quite a long time ago, and everybody from across a pretty broad spectrum, there were a lot of people who were very aware of it and who were involved in the implementation committee as well, too. But, they did kind of do it a little bit earlier. So it'll make the discussion, I think, slightly different.
Okay. A couple questions that have come in. This one is from Larry and asking about the security deposit portion / first last month's rent. Since all rent is paid in advance, typically due on the first of the month for the whole month, if a 1-year lease is signed on March 15th, so mid-month, with rent and possession to commence April 1st, can the landlord only require, separate from any deposit, only the April 2021 rent, or can the landlord require the April 2021 rent and the March 2022 rent? So can a landlord ask for first and last plus a deposit, is Larry's question, I think.
Gotcha. So if you look at and they do a really good job of explaining this in one of the handouts that the city put together does a really nice job of laying out some scenarios. So what you can require, if somebody meets your screening criteria, you can require a security deposit for 1 month's rent, and kind of regardless, you can require 1 month of rent. You can add an additional month of prepaid rent or an additional month of security deposit if somebody doesn't meet your requirements. But it doesn't look like there's a mechanism in there to include multiple months rent if you're starting in the middle of a lease period. But what you could do is just charge a month of rent at the start.
Okay. Larry also asks, does the just cause provision apply to oral month-to-month leases as well as term written leases? I guess that would be the alternative.
Yeah, so just cause applies regardless of whether or not there's a written lease, is my understanding.
That's my sense of it too.
Yeah. Having a written lease is always a really good thing. I make my plug for written leases because then everybody has a common understanding of what their rights and responsibilities are. I think it's better for tenants, and I think it's better for landlords as well to have everything in writing. But regardless, yeah, those just cause requirements, they apply to month-to-month leases and they apply to oral leases. Any lease agreement would it have that kind of like just cause if it's for residential rental property.
And it's I don't want to keep you longer than it's 2 o'clock, so I wanted to give you a heads up that it is. What we might be able to do, we have a few questions remaining. We can, Mike and I can try to answer them a little bit later. Otherwise, maybe what we'll do is we'll collect them, and if we're able to answer them, post them with the slides and the recording of this on our website afterwards.
That sounds great. Yes. And here is my email address. I'm pretty accessible. I respond to emails. Also, Eric, I kindly ask you to remove my typo that added one too many S's to as. And thank you, everybody. And once again, let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Really appreciate you joining us today. So we'll collect some of those questions. Maybe I'm going to collect them to the side here, and if we think we can get them. We do have some other questions that were submitted in advance about the suspension and related stuff. So we're going to get to those as well. And just a reminder, I did put it in the chat that today we are applying for CLE credit for today's seminar, and it would be a 1.5 90-minute CLE credit. Will follow up after the fact when that's approved. So with that, I'll pass it back over to Mike, and we'll continue on items related to both the federal and the state eviction suspensions.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And I apologize in advance about or for sort of shifting quickly from one topic that we were getting a nice conversation going on into the other topic, but we need to make sure we talk about kind of our bread and butter issue, which has been the key issue that we've talked about since April of last year, which is the eviction moratorium, COVID-19 specific rules. The St. Paul ordinance, we just wanted to inform people, hey, this is something that just became enacted March 1st. And so those of you in St. Paul should be aware of this and touch on the basics of it. But yeah, we're going to talk about the eviction moratorium now. Normally, when we talk about the eviction moratorium, how we've done that is we've gone with the state moratorium based on an executive order from the governor first. Why? It's the biggest hurdle for a landlord to be able to file an eviction in Minnesota. It remains the biggest hurdle. However, there's substantial movement potentially happening at the legislative level. And so we're going to leave, I think, more time for that conversation. And so I'm going to start with the federal moratorium first, which again, this is the second hurdle, the smaller hurdle. In fact, the CDC moratorium doesn't really even matter most cases in Minnesota currently, because the CDC moratorium on evictions, federally based, specifically defers to a state moratorium if it's got more tenant protection built into it, which Minnesota's does in most cases. So here's the latest on the CDC moratorium, and there's been some news on the CDC moratorium as well, so it's worth spending some time here. All right, the current version of the CDC moratorium expires March 31. So we've had, this is our third deadline for the CDC moratorium. The first one was the end of December, December 31 of last year. That version was issued through the CDC, signed by President Trump back in September, I believe it was, is when it took force of last year. Then there was an interim agreed upon by the legislature, the federal legislature, so the Senate, the US House, and signed again by President Trump for yet another month that extended through January 31. When President Biden took office, he extended the CDC moratorium through March 31, which is the one that we're currently under. That's the only one that's active at the federal level currently. Now, President Biden has indicated that he wishes to have the CDC moratorium extended through September, but I think he's hoping for legislative authorization of that, which hasn't occurred yet. What will happen on March 31? We're only 3 weeks away from that. If that's not extended legislatively, will the president extend the CDC executive order again? We don't know. You never know until it actually happens. These things, sometimes they telegraph it a day or two before, maybe a week before, but it's already 3 weeks from now. And so at some point, it's going to have to be declared whether it's going to end or not. The CDC moratorium has been challenged on the court level, though, as well. And that's what I want to spend a little bit of time talking about. We've seen at least 4 federal district courts have taken this issue up in a variety of different states. And in 3 of the 4 cases, oh, I'm sorry, can you go back to the, thanks. Yeah, 3 of the 4 cases, the district court, this is a federal district court, has ruled in favor of the CDC's order, saying, yes, the CDC has the power to do this. So the courts that have approved it, I'm sorry, that have approved of the CDC's enforcement of their executive order, essentially, one in Louisiana, one in Ohio, one in Georgia. But then in late February, a district court in Texas ruled against the CDC order, the Terkel versus CDC order. Go ahead then, Eric, thanks. Yeah, so the federal judge in Texas sided with the landlords, and one of the CDC's sort of key arguments is this is interstate commerce. We have a right to regulate this. The government does in general, whether it's Congress or the judicial branch. And the judge here found that this is an overreach. This is the federal government going into state law, which when most of these court cases are challenging the federal rule, they're arguing, among other things, hey, wait a second, evictions are state procedures. They're state created procedures. They're state legislatively dictated procedures. So the federal government shouldn't have any role in that. And the judge actually, I can't remember the exact line that he used, something like, apartment buildings don't cross interstate lines or something like that was the judge's line. Which, yeah, that's true. It's rare you see an apartment building moving from one state to another. I guess it's theoretically possible, but, and again, sort of the summation phrase that the judge used was, although the COVID-19 pandemic exists, so does the Constitution. The court case doesn't really stop the, this from going forward. The CDC moratorium from being enforced, still having a role at this point. It still has the primary task of stopping evictions throughout the country. The case itself is limited to the parties involved. The language of the case itself says that. But the judge issues sort of a veiled threat that if the federal government continues to enforce this, then maybe it would be expanded more. Go ahead and go to the next slide if you could, too, Eric. All right, so look, I'm a landlord-tenant lawyer, which basically means that almost all of my work is rooted in state law. That's how landlord-tenant law is essentially created. I very rarely look at a federal law. The CDC order, the Fair Housing Act, discrimination rules. Other than that, federal laws don't play much of a role in landlord-tenant law. And so my awareness of how the court systems work is usually limited to how does it work in a housing court or conciliation court, small claims court, district court, Minnesota Court of Appeals, Minnesota Supreme Court. Those are the courts we generally care about in my line of work. But here we've got federal rules playing a part. And so it helps to understand a little bit about the federal court system. So you see on your screen a map of the United States and a bunch of color coding along with numbers. So those numbers are the circuits or areas of the country that are grouped together. So Minnesota in the 8th Circuit is grouped with the Dakotas, Nebraska, and then all the way down to Arkansas, okay? You can see that the West Coast, California, both of the Pacific, Alaska and Hawaii. As I mentioned, there was a ruling, the first ruling on the CDC order was in the 11th Circuit in Georgia, which only encompasses 3 states. Okay. The Ohio one, that's in the 6th District. And then we have the ones in Texas and Louisiana. Those are in the same district, both in the 5th District or the 5th Circuit. So which one prevails? Which court decision would prevail? Well, it can get complicated. Does a ruling from a Texas judge, let's say the Texas judge said, you know what, the CDC moratorium, I'm declaring unconstitutional for everybody within the power of my gavel, wherever, as far as my gavel reaches. How far does that gavel reach? Well, it is complicated. Like I said, I don't live in the federal court world. That's not the kind of thing I do. But we have a contrary decision in the same circuit. So it's likely this is, I mean, in Texas, the adverse ruling to the CDC, the federal government, the Department of Justice, I believe is the entity in charge of this, has issued a notice of appeal saying they're going to appeal the decision. So it's likely to go up to the Court of Appeals at the federal level. Now, let's say we get contrary decisions at the federal Court of Appeals level. If that happens, it's not a guarantee, but it's usually the kind of thing that the US Supreme Court is more interested in taking. If there's differing legal assessments from differing circuits, that's one of those times when they'll step in. It's not a guarantee. There's very few guarantees the types of cases the Supreme Court will take. I think the only one that I'm very familiar with is if there's an actual dispute between states about a boundary line. The Supreme Court will almost always take those. You might wonder, well, how does boundary change? Well, rivers shift. And so a lot of boundaries are based on rivers. So those are sort of the guaranteed, these are going to the US Supreme Court cases. But everything else doesn't really have much of a sure track to the Supreme Court, the federal Supreme Court. They get to decide which cases they wish to hear. To sum this up, it's being litigated. This decision, the Texas Terkel decision, certainly calls into question the CDC moratorium more than it had been before, unquestionably. Look, there's no arguing that the CDC's executive order issued last September under President Trump was a new step for the CDC. They'd never done that before. And the Texas decision, in fact, talked about that. Hey, you didn't do this when the pandemic happened for smallpox after World War I. You didn't do this during the Great Depression. You're doing it now. So what gives you the right to do it now is sort of the gist of what the federal court judge was stating in a roughly 50-page decision. But again, the other three district court judges, when they wrote their decisions, were all saying, well, yeah, this is clearly within the purview of the CDC's powers and the government in general to control this. So it's completely contradictory conclusions with roughly the same information. I mean, you could argue that Texas's rules were being interpreted on a federal level versus Louisiana's versus Georgia's versus Ohio's. You can make all those arguments too. There are different takes on the state version of these rules, but ultimately these were all filed in federal court. So they're looking at federal constitutional questions versus states' rights to oversee their own eviction process. So anyhow, this is a change from the last time we spoke in depth about the CDC order. And it's, I think, very fair to say that it's less certain how long the CDC order will last than it was 3 weeks ago when this decision had not been issued. And once again, we have the March 31 deadline. That is a real deadline. It is approaching, and there's been no extension of that yet. Will there be? Maybe. You could argue that they're waiting to see what this court case might be. Unclear what exactly the Biden administration or Congress is waiting on to decide what to do. Maybe they want to wait until the last moment to make a decision, looking at the numbers, the fatalities, the hospitalizations, the vaccinations. Those are all legitimate numbers to consult, and maybe it makes sense to decide this on the last day of March. But people are trying to plan their lives. Landlords are trying to plan on when they're going to get paid. Tenants are trying to plan on whether or not they're going to get evicted. And everybody's looking at that giant pot of money, $375 million in Minnesota, but Minnesota's not alone. Every state in the country is getting some of this money. And so they're trying to figure out, okay, hey, can we get the money to the landlords before the evictions need to be filed? And so those are the considerations that are being weighed several hundred levels above my pay grade. I'm just trying to inform everybody watching about where we're at with the CDC moratorium. Okay, that's my federal court analysis. On to Minnesota. So I'm going to start with what is in the Minnesota moratorium, and then we're going to talk about what's being kicked around. First up, we still have our executive order. Again, if you want to find an executive order in Minnesota, it's easy. You Google it up, type in Minnesota executive orders. You might want to type in governors as well, and that'll get you there faster. And these are the coordinates. EO is executive order. 20 is 2020. That's the year. And 79 is the 79th order issued in 2020. This was in August of last year. And it set our current rule on the eviction moratorium, which most importantly means that a landlord can't file an eviction for non-payment of rent. Why is that most important? Almost every eviction in Minnesota is about non-payment of rent, well over 90% of them. So that stops most evictions from being filed. Now, there are some other reasons that a landlord can't file an eviction currently. A tenant has an unauthorized occupant. The boyfriend or girlfriend has moved in. They have a pet and they're not supposed to. Those are things that normally a landlord could file an eviction for, what we'd call a breach of the lease. Landlord can't currently file in Minnesota for those reasons. There are, in fact, a specific list of exceptions where a landlord is allowed to file an eviction in Minnesota right now. And they haven't changed since August, but here they are. If the tenant is seriously endangering others on the premises, if they have caused significant property damage, if the landlord or their immediate family member needs to move in to the rental unit, or if the tenant has violated a state law that's been around since the 90s that bans a tenant from having illegal guns, illegal drugs, illegal prostitution. All prostitution is illegal, stolen property in their property. Those are the exceptions that are on the books right now. That's what a landlord can file an eviction for right now. So that's a handful of reasons versus the normal long list of reasons that a landlord might be able to file an eviction for. Now, this Minnesota moratorium is tied in time to the peacetime emergency declaration that we've all heard about. That's what gives the governor the power to shut down schools, or at least make them go remote, to make salons close their door, to make churches close their doors, make bars, bowling alleys, movie theaters, all those things, restaurants, or they can open up the restaurant at half capacity, or the governor can mandate that masks be required to be worn in places. The peacetime emergency declaration is what gives the governor the power to do all those things unilaterally without legislative agreement. But that power is limited in time to 30 days at a time. And at any point right now, the legislature is in session. The legislature could end the peacetime emergency, which would in turn end the eviction moratorium as well. However, both chambers of the Minnesota legislature would have to vote to end the peacetime emergency. So the governor, Governor Walz, is a Democrat, DFL party. The Senate is controlled by Republicans. There have been 6 or 7 votes since the peacetime emergency has been declared. And every time the Senate has voted to end the peacetime emergency powers of the governor. Every time, however, the House, controlled by Democrats, they have the majority there, the DFL party, has voted not to end the peacetime emergency powers of the governor. So again, both chambers have to vote on this. Simple majorities, you don't need 2/3 or 3/4 or some giant number like that that you do for some extraordinary things. But both chambers of the Minnesota legislature would have to vote to end the peacetime emergency powers. Or the governor could end them. They've been renewed 11 times already. If the legislature is not in session every time the governor renews this peacetime emergency declaration, which again, the eviction moratorium is tied to, then the legislature is immediately called in automatically for a special session. So, I mean, it's mid-March already. The legislative session will end when it ends. I'm not exactly sure when it is. It's in May, sometime this year. But if they haven't, if the peacetime emergency is still ongoing, and the eviction moratorium is still there, there's a chance that there'd be a special session every 30 days again, like there was, from June on last year through the remainder of the calendar year last year. Each time that the governor declares another extension of the emergency declaration, there would be yet another vote. Now, there are 2 other ways the peacetime emergency or the eviction moratorium either and or could end. A court could decide that these are unconstitutional. That's been tried in several different directions, not just about landlord-tenant issues, but so far unsuccessfully in Minnesota. However, go ahead and go to the next slide, Eric. Yeah, we could have a legislative end to the eviction moratorium. So there are competing bills at this point. I think that's the right word. I don't work in the legislature often. It's not really my line of work. I'm somebody who advises renters on a daily basis directly. But been watching these bills. The Senate file 1470 is now, I think, on the Senate floor or being sent to the Senate floor. Is that right, Eric?
Yeah, and I'll put a link in the chat in a minute here to it. But yeah, Senate File 1470 is authored by Senator Draheim, who's the chair of the Housing Committee in the Senate, and It went through that housing committee last week, I believe, and then yesterday, the House Civil Law Committee heard that bill, and it's been amended twice. I think the current version that I'll share the link is slightly outdated, but not tremendously so. It'll get updated probably today or tomorrow. But yeah, now that bill is waiting to for the full Senate, I believe, the full Senate to take it up on the floor if that's what they wish to do.
Right. So that's where that bill is. The House file bill, number 12, has not been heard in any legislative committees yet, right?
Yes, House File 12 was introduced, I think, on day one of the legislature or soon after. And the current version of the bill was, I think, some sort of draft effort at a off ramp of some type or end of the suspension. But yeah, now there's going to be a hearing tomorrow on different, at least if it gets accepted into the committee, which it likely should, sort of a delete all amendment on that bill, which I'll post in the chat as well.
And that was posted today, right? This new version of House File number 12?
It was posted earlier today.
Yep. Okay. So it's very much in the infancy of the legislative process versus Senate File 1470, which the whole Senate could vote on if they decided to at this point, right?
I think so. Yeah, I'm not sure about the timeline on how quickly the Senate can vote on that, but I think they could. Of course, that Senate file up until today did not have a companion bill in the House. That was actually just introduced today. So yeah, in order for that to really actually move forward, there has to be action taken on both bills unless this language somehow ends up in some sort of other vehicle or omnibus bill or something like that.
Okay. Okay. So look, we got the language of this bill officially, just like everybody else had access to it today. It was the first that we could look at it. And we've been looking at the entire comparing and contrasting Senate File 1470 and House File 12. What appears in both bills that would be a substantial change from where we are right now. Again, we've got the executive order banning non-payment evictions and really only allowing evictions for a handful of pretty serious issues, endangering others, significant property damage, drugs, guns, prostitution, or the landlord or their family member wants to move in. But both of these versions, both Senate File 1470 and House File 12, allow an eviction for something called a material breach. I think both of them use that actual two-word combination, material and breach. And somebody actually asked about this earlier in reference to the St. Paul ordinance as well, saying, hey, what does material mean? That's a pretty subjective question. There is not a statutory definition of what a material breach of a lease is. That doesn't exist in Minnesota. There are cases that interpret that. And it is honestly somewhat subjective to some degree. I'll tell you what has worked for landlords in the past as material breaches of a lease. Alleging that a tenant has an unauthorized occupant, again, the boyfriend or girlfriend, a pet when they're not supposed to. They have excessive noise. They're smoking in a non-smoking building. Those are things that have worked for landlords and many other reasons. In our hotline, where we take between 14 to 16,000 calls a year, we also have an email and attorney service. And I'm the primary point person usually that looks at those first and figures out, okay, am I going to send off a message reply? Am I going to give it to a different attorney who works on that area or not? But I see most of these emails. And I literally read leases almost every day I work, a different lease. I'm not, this isn't really a brag or an attempt at it. I'm not sure that there's anybody in the state that reads more different leases than I do personally. It's just a key part of my job to read a lease. Tenants send them in frequently when they're asking a question via an email. And so I look at leases all the time, and I can tell you there's a lot of variation in leases. And one landlord's version of what a material breach of a lease might be very different from another landlord's. Some leases have no drinking allowed. Sometimes landlords really care about that deeply. Other times they're running like a quasi sober house. That's maybe the most important thing in their lease in their mind. They'd forgive non-payment of rent before they'd forgive somebody showing up with a bottle in their hand. Okay, understood. But other leases might include a no drinking clause, which is perfectly legal, by the way, for a landlord to do. But they're not going to enforce it if it's violated. They just don't think it's that big a deal. They just got it in a lease that they found somewhere online or something like that. And the variety of things that landlords will include in a lease that they care about enough to have included in their lease. Sometimes a landlord will download an internet lease and they haven't given it any thought at all. In fact, that's a giant percentage of landlords, but many landlords add extra things in at the end, special provisions, or the additional clauses where it's 6 or 7 blank lines that are left for the landlord to add in whatever they want. And it might be strange stuff. No fighting, no swearing. I've seen no swearing show up in leases before. Is that a material breach? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. What's a judge going to say to that? And that's ultimately a material breach is defined by whatever a judge thinks a material breach might be. Again, I can tell you the ones that are guaranteed winners for landlords, but it starts to get murky when you read every clause of a lease and you see what landlords are saying a tenant can or can do in their property as part of the contract that they agree to. And so material breach, I understand why people think, hey, that's an unfair, subjective phrase. It's what we have. And I can't define it for you enough to make it an absolute yes or no question on whether something's a material breach for everything that might be brought up. But I can tell you that if material breach is added to the exceptions to evictions, there's going to be a lot more evictions filed and quickly because landlords are going to say, hey, that's the reason I'm going to file. Not listing non-payment of rent, even though a tenant might be 10 months behind in rent, they're going to say the real reason I want them out is they've got a parakeet. And so that's what I'm going to go file an eviction before. And maybe the lease has a no parakeet clause or no pet clause or whatever it might be. What else is different about these bills? Well, there's very different timelines. When a landlord is allowed to do things, whether it's filing an eviction itself, the actual court case, or when they're allowed to non-renew or terminate a lease. And as mentioned, these bills are at very different legislative stages right now. And so we had thought about posting both of them and going line by line through the differences of each of them. But I think if there's one safe bet about both of these bills, well, here's what can't happen. Both of them can't become the law. It doesn't work. They're too different. There's going to have to be one version that emerges between the two. Maybe a brand new version will come out. But there's going to be some sort of compromised agreement, most likely, at some point. Or else we're just going to be left with what we have right now. And I guess the governor could issue a brand new order saying, here's what I want to have the change be, as the governor has done. The governor's actually, we're on our 3rd version of the eviction moratorium currently. It's just that the latest version we've had for 6-7 months already. And so that could happen. The governor could change the eviction moratorium once again if they don't have any kind of satisfaction with the legislative approach. Or there could be a agreed upon, crafted, legislatively jigsaw puzzle put together agreement between the Senate and the House that ultimately gets signed by the governor, which is how most of our laws are generally created. We've just got this executive order season that started when the pandemic began. And so that is another option for laws being essentially dictated by the governor at this point, by the power that they have. Okay. I think I've said what I need to say about the legislative process that we're at. I am happy to start with the questions that we normally leave quite a bit of time for. We still have half an hour to go, and I'm sure that some of the questions are probably left over. And so Eric, I'll let you pick where you want to start with whatever we want to answer here.
Sure. And I was just gonna reiterate one thing that I think is important on this last slide, and that's again just that, you know, what Mike said. Neither of these are the law yet, and it's probably going to be some time until that happens. So we're just providing this as an update, and we'll, you know, try to continue to do this on future seminars just so that folks have an idea of what's being discussed. But again, for right now, 2079 is still in effect until next Monday, and that will potentially get extended. And we'll know more in 2 weeks when we have another session. And if there's been any updates on this stuff at the legislature, we'll talk about it. But again, the other exciting thing about the next seminar 2 weeks from today is we will have Rachel Robinson from Minnesota Housing on to discuss the new rental assistance program, and which a lot of people have been asking about for some time, and people have been waiting for that to get up and running. So hopefully we get some good details in 2 weeks on that. I am going to quickly jump to a question Larry submitted, because it's actually directly about these two bills that we just talked about. Isn't failure to pay rent a material breach? For a landlord, rent is probably the most material element of a lease.
Oh, I agree with that assessment, Larry. I think that rent is the most material element of a lease, which is why that's the majority of evictions that are filed. Certainly in the House bill, it's not as explicit in the Senate bill. Yeah, it's not a material breach. Well, it's not going to be a material breach under either of those versions. They're specifically accepting that from a material violation of the lease. There are leases, and this is a fair consideration, whatever legislation the decision makers want to craft. There are leases that say that multiple months of failure to pay rent amount to a material violation of the lease, or multiple late payments due. And so in those cases, a landlord might have a different argument if it's not caught at the legislative level and addressed there.
Sure. And then also kind of related to that, Ruth asked, could a city rule that certain things cannot be added as a material breach?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure I've seen that anywhere where a material breach was defined by a city, not just in Minnesota, but other cities in the country. Maybe would be my short answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and that actually goes back to a question that was asked of when Margaret was still on, related to the St. Paul ordinance. Under allowable just cause, what is material breach?
Right.
It is not defined in the ordinance, and that's right. If you bring up 2014,
You're talking about Ordinance 2014.
Yes,
That was an executive order for the eviction. The first one issued last year. Yeah,
that was
confusing.
Yep. But yeah, St. Paul ordinance, material non-compliance, if the tenant fails to cure a deficiency to a material breach of the lease. So do you have any thoughts on that?
So yeah, that actually gives the tenant a chance to cure it as well. You're looking at the just cause portion, right?
Yes.
Yeah, right. So that part gives the tenant a chance to actually cure it, which is not generally, and it's not, I don't think it's in either version that we're looking at in the Senate or the House right now. So let's use the unauthorized occupant, because that's the most common reason after non-payment of rent that landlords file an eviction. So in the St. Paul version, the landlord says, hey, I want to give you a just cause notice. You've got your boyfriend living here. Can the tenant ask the boyfriend to go, and would that solve the problem? Arguably, it would solve the problem in St. Paul. At the state level, though, the version's being kicked around for an eviction being filed. There is no cure period where the tenant can solve the problem. It's not required in Minnesota that a landlord allow for a cure period. There are some leases. These are under 10%, but there are some leases in Minnesota where a landlord just found a lease on the internet because they thought it looked okay. And it has a cure period built into the lease, which isn't required by law in Minnesota, but some leases just have it there. And it usually says that if tenant is in violation of this lease, landlord will give a notice, and tenant has blank days to cure the defect, or some phrasing like that. And then the landlord will just write in something. So everything else is typed, but they write in with a pen, 7 or 14 or 30. Those are the most common versions that I see. So there it would be a cure period, but in general, there's not a cure period necessarily allowed for a breach, not technically in Minnesota.
All right, so we're going to jump to some of the questions that were submitted in advance, not about the St. Paul ordinance. And we've got 25 minutes or so. So we'll try to get through as many as we can, including those that have come in since we started.
We should have time for every question that everybody has, though, at least for now.
Yeah. Okay. So Anne, I think a landlord asking, are annual rent increases based on increases in taxes, insurance, and utilities prohibited? So we weren't sure if this was directed at a specific situation, because right now there, as folks may have heard, there's been an effort in Minneapolis to propose a ballot initiative to allow the city to, in the future, if it were to pass, enact a rent control or rent stabilization. So that has not happened yet. So is this question maybe related to the current status of the executive orders, the eviction suspension, and there's also a price gouging executive order?
Yeah, so I'm not really sure what the landlord is referring to either, because in general, there's no rent control in Minnesota. That's not how our system is designed. So, and I'm sorry, did you mention that in the House file that there's the potential sort of rent increase limit as well?
I guess I didn't mention that, but that is true in the House file eviction off-ramp bill.
Which is just in the pandemic era, whatever that's going to be defined as. It seems to be limiting it to that, but still, it is something worth noting that it's in one of the competing bills at the Minnesota legislature in how to off-ramp the eviction, is a small version of rent control for a limited time. So I'm not exactly sure why the questioner or landlord would ask about that. In general, you don't need to justify an increase in rent. You don't have to say why you came up with the number you came up with. You can just say, I mean, it's just like if you wanted to sell your car, right? If you wanted to sell a 1998 Ford Escort with 195,000 miles on it, can you ask for $1 million? Well, sure, you can ask for $1 million if you want to. You can put the sticker on it, and you can put it on Craigslist or advertise it anywhere you want. Doesn't mean anybody's going to pay you the $1 million, but you can ask for the $1 million. That's the general rule about rental prices. Now, landlords don't ask for $1 million because it'll price them out of the market and nobody will rent the place. And so the market dictates that to some degree. But Minneapolis's proposed rent control, which is very much in its infancy as far as the conversation goes, I believe. And the governor's version, potentially in the House, well, I guess it's the House version, is a potential short-term implementation of a type of rent control as well.
All right. We got a question from Peter. And it looks like Peter also just asked us the same question, I think maybe in the chat. Let me make sure these questions are similar. Renter moved large dog and 2 cats in. No paperwork, maybe support animal paperwork completed. Multiple requests. HUD subsidizes the tenant's portion owed. What can the landlord do? Is there anything more in the chat on this? Material breach for bringing a dog in that was not. Okay, so yeah, material breach for a pet is the question.
Yeah, short answer is right now, Peter, you can't file an eviction for that today. I don't think you could. You'd have to argue that your tenant is causing significant property damage, or has already caused significant property damage, I should say, or seriously endangering others. So unless the dog is a menace to everybody else, I don't think you can file an eviction right now under the governor's moratorium. Under both proposals, the House proposal and the Senate proposal, yeah, I think you could file an eviction. That's the actual court case where you file a UD, unlawful detainer eviction, pay the $300 as a landlord to start the case. You would be able to file an eviction for that type of breach, but we're not there yet, and we don't know when that will be. We don't charge anything for these webinars, so it's not like we make a profit from it, but this is honestly why we're doing these webinars. This exact webinar today is why we've been doing these webinars since April. We were actually kicking back and forth how to present what we're going to present today at 1:25, because the rules are just moving. And they have. Since the pandemic started, the rules have just changed a lot, and sometimes very quickly without much notice. State level, the federal level, in many parts of the country on local levels as well. And so I guess I would really ask anybody that's interested in this, thinks that they need to stay up to date on it. Every couple of weeks, we're going to be doing another one of these. And I can't imagine we're not going to be talking about the shift in the moratorium for the next 6 months, because there's going to be changes throughout. And certainly next time, I have no idea what we're going to be talking about next time. I know we have a guest planned, but what we're going to be talking about as far as the rules, no real clue what they're going to be by that day. They might be very different.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, that goes to, I think some of the point of why the legislature is, both the Senate and the House are working on these bills, is that, you know, there needs to be some sense of consistency for everybody involved. Otherwise, one of the things that we've been saying since sort of day one is that the courts will have could have difficulty handling what might be a confusing mix of cases that come in because of the differing changes in the rules. Peter followed up that question: is the rule the same for non-renewal? And I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, the answer right now, Peter, is yes. The rule is the same for non-renewal. The executive order that we're all playing under right now, the rules we're all abiding by, is 20-79, and it treats evictions, the court cases, and non-renewals or terminations of the lease essentially the same. So if you gave your tenant today a notice, get out by the end of next month notice, you'd be in violation of EO 20-79. You might get a call from the Attorney General's office, and if you don't abide by what they tell you the rule is, then they can try to enforce it.
All right, we had a question from Kim. This is kind of a more directed at what Homeline is going to be doing. Will Homeline eventually do legislative update on the many probable revisions to Chapter 504B of Minnesota statutes? That's the tenant landlord law chapter. There's some significant revisions that will really change the landscape of property management, and they could be maybe have been coming for a long time, but they could be a shock for some folks, especially when combined with new local ordinances such as Minneapolis and St. Paul. So yeah, I mean, I think the quick answer to that is, you know, as it relates to immediate eviction suspension legislation, we've talked about that today, and we'll continue to add that to our agenda for future seminars. And if there's a point at which there is like some real clarity about what the bill is going to be, or what the policy is going to be moving forward for an off-ramp, we'll host a webinar and discuss it. And I think on a broader basis, Kim might be also talking to the fact there are a lot of tenant landlord related bills that have been introduced in both the House and the Senate, quite a few in the House, many of which have gotten hearings and gotten through to the House floor, some of which are policies that Homeline and groups that we work with have advocated for and testified in support of. But I think it's always sort of the same question: is it's not clear until it is clear on if a bill is going to get passed. And so at a future one, we can maybe talk about what some of the proposals are, and if there is any provisions that do get passed by May. And usually tenant landlord bills go into effect like July 1st or something like that. But we'll talk about them if there's things that get passed. I don't know if there's more you want to add, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, the real focus of all of these presentations that we've been trying to do, with some exceptions, is we've been trying to say, here's what is. These are the rules as they are today. There are all kinds of theoretical rules that we've talked about at times, and we're talking about a couple today, but they are introduced bills that are seriously being considered. And I think it's generally viewed that something is going to be passed on one of those bills. A lot of the bills that I think Kim is referring to right now are not sure things on any level. And so maybe these will evolve, these sessions will evolve. I don't know, 2 years from now, maybe we'll be doing one a month where we'll talk about stuff that could be the law more than what is the law. But right now we're just trying to keep up with what the law is because it shifts so much. And I know it's going to shift a lot soon.
Yeah. So what should we do here? Should we jump to some more suspension related questions, or do you want
Yeah,
to
let's
try
do
to-
those first, and
Okay.
then we'll take whatever we can from the St. Paul ordinance.
All right, so give me a second here. Well, let's jump to Jane's question here. Jane's got a tenant, and the written lease was up. Maybe this is a mistake. Maybe it was up June of last year. Due to COVID, she's not moved out. Tenant has had a drug issue on Section 8 housing, $2,000 behind. There was an issue where she threatened another tenant with a weapon. Police were called, wouldn't allow the police in. She's done things like changing locks and disabling smoke detectors. Windows are covered. Can this landlord file an eviction? The landlord believes the tenant's a threat to herself and other tenants.
Yeah, so the question about can we file an eviction, again, has to be asked under the rules as they are. Can a landlord file an eviction under the rules as they are? And again, here are the exceptions. Is the tenant violating a specific state law, Minnesota statute 504B.171, which talks about how a tenant can't have illegal weapons, sawed-off shotguns, automatic weapons. You've been convicted of a felony, illegal drugs, engaging in prostitution or have stolen property. Does that one fit? Is the landlord, another exception is the landlord planning, does the landlord need, or their family member, do they need to move into the property on their own for a place for themselves to live? That's exception 2. Exception 3, has the tenant caused significant property damage? That's the 3rd exception. I'm not sure that that really fits with what's been described here. Is the tenant seriously endangering others? I don't know, maybe. This is the kind of thing that cases are being filed for, and a tenant can say, hey, I didn't do what the landlord's accusing me of. The landlord has the burden to prove that what happened in their complaint is what actually happened. So could a landlord file an eviction for what's written in the thing? Sure, but they'd have to prove it and convince a judge that she is seriously endangering others on the property. But yeah, an eviction is possible here. A 30-day notice a landlord could give, but it doesn't really have much meaning right now. You'd still have to file an eviction. And so
The 7-day notice.
you have to give
required.
a 7-day
Yeah.
notice,
Yeah.
right? There's not a 30-day notice requirement, but there is a 7-day notice requirement if you're going to file an eviction for that reason under the current law. But maybe is a short answer. Realistically, Jane, I think it's worth your time and a little bit of money to talk to a landlord attorney, an attorney that actually does landlord tenant law that represents landlords, to see if they think that you have a viable case. They're going to ask a lot about what proof you have, because that's going to be the key to this case. There's a handful out there. Kim Tennyson is one that we mentioned earlier. She submitted some questions earlier. She knows this stuff, and I'm sure she'd be happy to talk to you to figure out if there's a right move for you to go forward here. But it's not the kind of case that if I were a landlord, I'd want to take on my own.
Right. And then an anonymous question: if nothing changes, when can evictions start being filed again for non-payment? We've answered it, but
I think it's April 1st would be the first day that evictions could be filed for non-payment of rent, because the CDC moratorium is through March 31. The state moratorium is through March 15th. Tenants would have to do some stuff. They'd have to swear on a piece of paper that they are behind and they're trying to pay, and that would get them 2 more weeks. So I think April 1st, if nothing changes, would be the first day that landlords could really start to file evictions for non-payment of rent in Minnesota.
But again, the state suspension ends on the 15th, next Monday, and signs have pointed in the past to Governor Walz extending that. So we don't have any knowledge about that in advance, but be on the lookout in the news over the weekend, I guess, or Friday. Another anonymous question: I'm a tenant advocate. Can landlords charge a garage deposit and a monthly garage fee? If they charge one or both of these, does it have to be in the lease to be enforceable?
So I can't tell if this is really a St. Paul specific question or not. If it's not St. Paul, short answer is yeah. A landlord can charge a garage deposit and a monthly garage fee. There's no law against either one of those things being introduced. As far as the St. Paul ordinance, I think it would count as part of, actually, I'm not sure. I haven't looked at that part of the ordinance enough to know whether it would be a bypass for the landlord on the security deposit question. It would be a little bit tricky. I think if I were trying to do that as a landlord, I would have to say the garage is optional to start with, which sometimes it is. A garage spot is optional versus it's just included. But if you're going to say, hey, look, it's $1,000 for this place and you get a 2-car garage as part of it, then you couldn't charge a garage fee / garage deposit on top of it. But no, just looking at the security deposit.
Security deposit is defined in the St. Paul ordinance as the same as under 178.
Yeah, so that doesn't limit anything about garages. Again, I think if you have a separate agreement for the garage deposit and garage rent, probably okay as the landlord on top of the regular deposit cap. But outside of St. Paul, sure. Yeah, you can do that.
All right. 10 minutes or so left here. Got a lot of questions, so we'll try to get to them. When a social worker asking, when landlords put things like shoveling, lawn work, et cetera, into a lease, saying it's the tenant's responsibility to do so, do they have to provide rent reduction for this additional responsibility?
Can it be in the lease? Yes. Does the landlord have to compensate the tenant for doing the work? Yeah, they do. And this is based on a state law from the 70s. It's not a new rule. 504B.161, which Eric will probably throw a link up in the chat box for you. And it's got to be an agreement in writing. It doesn't have to be in the lease. It could be somewhere else, but it's got to compensate the tenant a fair price for doing the work, whether it's mowing or shoveling, the two most common things we'll see. You'll see a lot of landlords that don't do this, especially a duplex or a single family home. They think that there's some sort of exception for them, but there isn't. The law applies to all landlords. If they want the tenant to shovel or mow, they're supposed to pay him. It's supposed to be a fair price, and it's supposed to be an agreement in writing.
Okay. Let's see here. There's Kara is on, and she's the leader of a resident association. Landlord has told us that they cannot evict, us being, I guess, the resident association, they cannot evict someone for smoking in a non-smoking property. But my understanding is that warrant of inhabitability covers this to evict. Who's correct?
So right now, I think it's a much tougher case for a landlord to file an eviction against a tenant for smoking in a non-smoking building. If we had no pandemic, could a landlord file an eviction for that? Sure. They'd have some proof issues. They'd have to prove that the tenant is smoking. And so sometimes that's difficult to do, to have anybody actually see them do it and pin down where the smoke is coming from. But can a landlord file an eviction for that? Yeah. If either one of these new bills gets passed, then I think under both of them, a landlord could file an eviction for that. Or if the, but under the executive order that we have currently, could a landlord file an eviction arguing that the smoker is significantly causing property damage? Maybe, I guess you could make that argument. Or seriously endangering others. I think that's going to be a little more fact specific. If you have a neighbor that's very sensitive to smoke, has asthma or some other condition that makes breathing really difficult, I guess it's an arguable eviction for the landlord to file. It's not a sure thing. I'm sure a landlord attorney would be telling their client, we can file it, but I'm not going to guarantee you that we're going to win.
And if this is in St. Paul, which it might be, if I recall correctly, there is the other hurdle of the St. Paul's just cause requirement. Sure. And so, but you know, if it is allowed for,
well, the landlord would argue that's a material breach.
A material breach. Yeah. Yep. So in many of these cases, it does need that non-smoking requirement would have to be in the lease, and it would be clarified as okay. So, I got a question here. What if my landlord raised my rent and renewed it last summer? I asked about month to month, as I didn't want to obligate during COVID, and was told they did not offer that. Can I use that illegal renewal force to resign or vacate to give notice and move out now with no penalty?
That is very confusing. If somebody called me up with that exact question, I'd have to ask them a lot of follow-up questions, because it sounds like they're on a month-to-month right now, so they could give a month's notice today to leave at the end of next month. And so I'm not sure if they're trying to leave faster than that or what their goal is. So this is one of those situations where I'd strongly recommend the person who sent this to contact our free tenant hotline or send a question to our email attorney of service to figure out the answer, because we're going to need more detail to give you the best answer.
Yep, and that number and the email link is right on our website. Is right on your screen right there. The hotline number and where you can email an attorney. And a comment about, it sounds like maybe this tenant wanted a month-to-month tenancy but wasn't offered that, and I don't think there's necessarily any obligation, but
like I said, I couldn't really tell, and it's not like we're trying to get a commission here. We're free. And you'll get to talk to somebody that knows the answer that can actually pin this down.
yeah, so go ahead and give us a call on our hotline, tenant, with that question. Another question, can a landlord charge one tenant $300 deposit and charge another tenant $600?
Wow, there's so many different answers to this question, because there's the St. Paul ordinance, there's the Minneapolis ordinance, right? There's everywhere else. The short answer is, other than those two cities potentially where there might be a limitation on the deposit, probably. Now, if you could argue successfully that the landlord is charging all the Native Americans a bigger deposit than they do anybody who's not Native American, then you'd have an argument that it's discrimination based on a protected class status. But if it's not that, it's and that might be hard to prove, that sort of thing, then the landlord probably can charge different amounts for a deposit. They're going to argue in some cases, hey, they have better rental history, credit, criminal record than the person that applied before you, and so that's why I'm charging a bigger deposit. And even in St. Paul and Minneapolis, there's this additional allowance to let a landlord go higher on a deposit if a tenant wouldn't have normally qualified for the apartment under its screening procedures.
Okay, let's see here. Let's see if we've got Paul writes in mentioning that because there were some questions about this, the House File 12 delete everything amendment. So again, that's the House initial proposal that will be heard in a House committee tomorrow for an eviction suspension ramp off. Has a 6% cap on rent increases, and it also defines material breach using language copied from case law.
Right. Again, this is Paul Bernberg, who Eric mentioned earlier is giving a upcoming CLE on security deposits. Paul was a longtime attorney working in our office, and is at least the second attorney I know that's offered some insight today during our session, which is always appreciated whenever there's attorneys that know this kind of field and are willing to share their thoughts. And Paul's right, there is a 6% increase cap on the on rent in the House file. There is also an attempt at defining what a material breach is based on some case law, but I would stand by my earlier statement that it still remains somewhat subjective.
Sure, and I've got the info about Paul's webinar. I'll put the link in the chat again in a moment. I think most of our questions are related to the St. Paul one. There's a couple remaining here, I guess. So Tammy asked, any thoughts on the rent control ordinance being considered by the Minneapolis City Council? I mean, so the council, I think, has voted to proceed with two efforts at ballot initiatives, and that goes to the Charter Commission, and the Charter Commission can do any number of things, recommend or not. The city can take the council can take their opinion or not, and then ultimately vote on something. But what they're voting on right now, the city council, is to add a ballot initiative to either allow the council or the voters in the future the ability to vote on a rent control policy. There may be some details out there about what a potential rent control or rent stabilization policy might be, but that's not what the decision is right now. Right now, the decision that may go to Minneapolis voters in November, which is it's still not finalized that'll happen, is simply to question, should the city have the authority to enact the rent control policy? So that's sort of where things are at with that. Do you see
Which they have to do by state law. If they want to have a rent control provision, they have to go through this process first, or else they can't even enact a rule that says this.
There is a state statute from quite a while back that prohibits
Early 80s, I want to say.
Yeah, prohibits rent control, but then it has an exception section that allows for it if a city does something like this. So Katie asked if a new bill is passed for evictions allowing material breaches to be grounds for an eviction, would this have to be a current breach? For example, i.e. a tenant had an unauthorized pent but has since rehomed it, or yeah.
It's going to depend on the language of the bill, frankly. Whatever gets through these, committees and, through the House, the Senate, and the governor, this is the kind of thing that's got to be ironed out. And language is going to matter a lot on this sort of thing. I mean, there are versions of this approach where the legislation could say that, the tenant has, again, what we call a cure period. So the landlord has to say what the breach is and say a deadline, and that the tenant has to solve the breach by the deadline, or else they can go file the eviction. Now, this generally works for what we call a continuing breach. A continuing breach is something like having somebody live with you, having a pet live with you. That's an ongoing breach versus a party, which generally is a one-time breach. They had a wild party, so I want them evicted for that. It's not a continuing breach. So if it's only continuing breaches, then it would limit what we're talking about substantially, but it's going to depend on the language of the actual law once it gets enacted.
Well, it's 3 o'clock. We have, I would say, 8 or so St. Paul specific questions. What do you want to do, Mike?
Well, we got 2 options. We can either submit them to Margaret, who was our expert testifier, and then she could answer them for us, which is, I think, what we sort of promised folks earlier on, which might make the most sense. And we can send them to the whole list of folks, right? It's not that much more buttons to click to send them to everybody who signed up for this.
What we'll do, what we'll do is we'll pass them on to Margaret, and I put her on the spot with that, so I don't want to require that she get back to us immediately. But when we do get the answers, if she's able to provide any related to these questions, which I think I've collected all of them, what we'll do is we'll post that on our website. The same link that you use to on our website to register, that's the same place where we'll actually post the slides from today, and it's where we will post the recording, and then eventually we'll post a PDF or something that has those questions and any answers that we're able to provide.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to re-answer questions that we've covered already today, but the ones that we didn't get to, that's the ones that we'll try to get an answer for.
Yeah. So with that, make sure I'm not missing any of these questions. Okay, I think I got them all. Thanks again for joining us today, and here's my thank you slide. Oh, it's gone. Thank you, and we'll call that the end of the day. Thanks.